Kansas, 1863. The prairie stretched endless, a quilt of tall grass swaying under a low, wide sky. The Mercer farm sat at the edge of that horizon, a plain house of weathered boards and a barn standing proud beside it. To a passing rider, it looked like any other farmstead born from the back-breaking work of settlers who had carved life from the soil. To the townsfolk, the Mercers were ordinary, even admired. They came to church every Sunday, carried their hymn books neatly wrapped in cloth, bowed their heads at prayers, and spoke of gratitude for the harvest. The parents were soft-spoken, the children polite. Neighbors often said that if one wished to see the picture of good Christian folk, one only had to look at the Mercer family. But behind those walls, in the silence between night winds and creaking timbers, something else lived. The war had scarred Kansas. Raiders, deserters, and lawless men rode the trails, leaving behind smoke and torn bodies. Children in town learned to recognize the smell of blood as easily as the smell of baking bread. Death was not foreign here, it was stitched into the earth like the roots of prairie grass. And in such a place, ordinary cruelty could pass unnoticed, blending into the chaos of the times. That was why no one questioned why the Mercer boys sometimes lingered in the barn long after chores were finished, why their lantern glowed long into the night, or why neighbors never heard laughter when they played, only a strange and heavy quiet. The Mercer parents carried themselves with a calmness that unsettled those who noticed. When others wept over lost sons at Gettysburg, they spoke instead of patience in God's design. When cholera swept through the county, they tended to their garden without fear, as if no sickness could touch them. Their eyes were steady, their words simple, their presence soothing to some yet faintly chilling to others. People excused it as prairie strength, the kind bred from endless labor and hardship. They did not know that within that calmness lay a silence so deep it seemed to absorb grief rather than feel it. At night the prairie carried sounds for miles. Coyotes howled. Owls shrieked. But near the Mercer farm, the night seemed thicker, as if sound itself was swallowed. The wind bent around the barn in peculiar ways, carrying with it faint groans mistaken for wood settling. Men returning late from the fields would sometimes glance toward the Mercer's land and quicken their pace, though they could not say why. It was not terror they felt but an unease that pricked like a thorn at the back of the neck. Evil rarely announces itself in screams, more often it seeps in through the stillness, patient, invisible, and certain. The Mercer boys were strong, their faces sunburnt and plain. They carried water, split wood, and walked with the awkward politeness of youth raised under discipline. They shook hands firmly at church gatherings, helped widows lift heavy baskets, and looked people in the eye. Yet beneath their courtesy was an attention too sharp, as though they watched people not with kindness but with an intensity that measured flesh, breath, and bone. When other boys wrestled or laughed, the Mercers stood apart, observing. Some children whispered that they did not blink as often as others. But when their parents were near, they smiled on cue, and their innocence seemed untouchable. It was the barn, though, that held their secret. Its walls were scrubbed clean, its tools arranged with almost military order. Neighbors admired its tidiness, never realizing that such order spoke not of good farming but of ritual. For within its loft, away from the sunlight, the Mercer boys began to write their own kind of scripture, not with words but with actions. The prairie was silent witness to their devotion, an unseen audience to the rehearsals of a darkness that wore the mask of family normalcy. In the town ledger, the Mercer name would be written beside donations to the church, supplies given to wounded soldiers, and goods traded fairly. Their record was spotless. Yet history often remembers only what is written, not what is buried. Beneath the weight of hymns and harvest, the Mercer farm bore a secret too heavy for the soil to hide forever. Something ancient stirred there, not born of the war or the land, but of the human mind, that hidden chamber where cruelty thrives in silence until it finds a form, a ritual, a home. And so, while Kansas bled openly in fields and towns, the Mercer family bled in silence, their darkness contained within wooden walls and sealed smiles. The prairie, wide and unending, kept their secret for now. But secrets cannot remain still forever. They breathe. They wait. They grow. The Mercer barn stood taller than it needed to, its wooden frame built strong as if it was meant to carry more than hay and tools. In daylight it seemed ordinary, but as dusk fell, it appeared to draw on the light rather than reflect it. Travelers passing along the dirt road often said the barn seemed alive, like it pulsed faintly with its own rhythm. Some swore they saw the walls flex in the corner of their eye, as if the structure itself was breathing. No one ever dared mention it aloud for fear of sounding mad, but the unease lingered in whispers, the kind exchanged over church pews and between market stalls when the Mercers were not in earshot. Strangeness always began with the animals. Horses stabled too close to the Mercer barn stamped nervously, pulling at their ropes until their skin bled raw. Chickens refused to roost inside, preferring to huddle outside in the cold. Neighbors lending tools would sometimes catch sight of the Mercer livestock, unusually fat and gleaming as though overfed, yet their eyes looked cloudy, as if they were staring at something unseen. There were stories of calves born with extra teeth or lambs that refused to die when their throats were cut for slaughter, shuddering long after the blade had done its work. Farmers spoke softly about such things, afraid of attracting bad luck, yet the rumors grew. The crops were stranger still. In a year when drought withered half the county, the Mercers' fields flourished. Corn rose taller than a man, with kernels swollen almost to bursting, their yellow deep into an unnatural shade. Potatoes were dug from the ground in clusters too heavy to carry without straining the back. The earth around the Mercer land seemed to give too much, as though something beneath the soil was feeding it with more than rain and sun. Families hungry from the war years looked at those fields with envy, yet when offered food from the Mercer table, many quietly refused, claiming it tasted sweet in a way that left the stomach unsettled. Inside the barn, the Mercer boys worked with a devotion that went beyond chores. The place was always locked tight, and when neighbors offered to help with harvest, the Mercers politely declined. The boys would disappear for hours, lanterns glowing through cracks in the wood, shadows bending strangely across the walls. At times a low hum could be heard, not voices exactly but the sound of breath drawn out longer than natural, rising and falling in uneven patterns. Those who came close enough swore it felt like standing near the chest of a giant beast, listening to its lungs pull in air. The older boy had a gift for drawing patterns with chalk on the barn floor, his hands steady as he sketched circles, triangles, and lines that crossed with mathematical precision. He studied the way pressure moved through wood and iron, how weight could be shifted without snapping, how hinges could be fixed so they bent but never broke. The younger boy learned the patience of craft, the skill of carving joints, the strength of pulling nails through timber without leaving splits. Together they built frames that seemed almost harmless, odd shapes that looked like ladders bent sideways or tables tilted at strange angles. But when placed in the barn's loft, they fit perfectly into the rituals the boys had begun to imagine. Every device carried a purpose. One rack was angled so the body could never rest flat, forcing the spine into a curve that turned breathing into a conscious act of endurance. Another used ropes threaded through pulleys to suspend weight and balance, lowering it only enough to touch the skin before pulling it back, repeating the cycle until the body beneath learned the rhythm of dread. The boys smiled at their ingenuity, proud of how they could keep the body alive while pushing it close to collapse, proud of how they could turn flesh into an instrument that played sounds no one had ever taught them. They called these sounds notes, and they whispered to each other that the barn was their chapel and these notes were its music. They tested small things first, starting with animals no one would miss. A rabbit tied to one of their frames trembled as the ropes tightened, its legs forced apart until the joints quivered. They watched it struggle, not with cruelty in the way a farmer might strike an animal for disobedience, but with fascination, as if they were listening to the secret language of suffering. They timed its breathing, noted how long it gasped before collapsing into silence, and then adjusted the device to stretch the interval further next time. A chicken suspended upside down revealed new lessons about panic, its wings beating the air in desperate bursts before weakening into stillness. Each test gave them new data, each failure corrected in wood and iron until the machine could carry life to the very brink without ending it. The older boy began to keep records in a hidden ledger, neat rows of numbers and short notes written in the same hand he used for church studies. He calculated how long it took for trembling to set in, how many minutes before eyes began to roll back, how many cycles of strain a body could endure before the heart threatened to break. The ledger was not filled with cruelty in the way neighbors would have imagined, but with the cold language of science, as if he were recording crop yields or weather patterns. This detachment was their greatest mask, the belief that what they did was not evil but discovery, the uncovering of laws that no preacher had yet spoken. The younger boy began to hear patterns in the suffering, rhythms that returned again and again like a heartbeat that refused to stop. He whispered to his brother that these were not accidents, that they were being shown something hidden, something the barn itself was teaching them. He claimed the air felt different when the devices were used, as if the barn was breathing with them, leaning in to listen. The older brother agreed in silence, though he never admitted aloud that he felt it too. They believed the barn had become alive, not in a way that could be seen with eyes, but in the way it seemed to lean closer when agony reached its peak, as if feeding on it. Yet in town, the Mercer boys were more courteous than ever. They shook hands, they helped mend fences, they sang with soft voices in church. No one could imagine that the same hands that held them books also held ropes threaded through pulleys, tightening and loosening with perfect patience. Their politeness became sharper, almost rehearsed, and neighbors admired how well behaved they were compared to other children. But beneath that politeness was a growing conviction that their instruments were more important than the fields, more important than chores, more important than the war that raged beyond their horizon. For them, the barn had become the true battlefield, and their experiments were the only victories that mattered. The tools grew stranger with time. One device used thin iron rods pressed against the chest in such a way that every breath forced the lungs to work harder, never enough to stop but always enough to hurt. Another frame used ropes and weights to hold limbs apart in perfect tension, keeping the body alive in suspension, stretched like a bowstring until the joints ached but never snapped. These machines were not crude, they were precise, carefully designed to prevent death while amplifying dread. It was cruelty refined into art, hidden in the loft of a barn that neighbors thought was simply tidy and well kept. The Mercer parents never entered the loft. Or if they did, they pretended not to see. Some whispered that they encouraged their boys' discipline, proud of their seriousness, blind to what seriousness had become. Others believed the parents knew more, that they had chosen silence as protection, preferring ignorance to the horror of truth. Whatever the reason, they allowed the barn to grow into something otherworldly, a breathing shrine to suffering that remained unseen by the world outside. And so the instruments waited, polished and ready, silent in the loft until the day would come when animals were no longer enough, when the boys' curiosity demanded more. Their politeness in town grew sharper, their eyes brighter, their rituals more deliberate. The masks of innocence still held, but beneath them, the boys were preparing for the moment when the music of their devices would finally be played on human breath. The prairie had grown used to children vanishing. Raiders stole them, sickness took them, accidents buried them under collapsed barns or drowned them in swollen rivers. Each loss was mourned, but none were unexpected. Life on the frontier carried death like a shadow. Yet when little Mary Ellis disappeared one autumn evening, the silence around her loss was different. Her shoes were found near the creek, her doll abandoned in the grass, but no footprints led away. The town searched, calling her name until their throats cracked, lanterns sweeping the tall grass like restless eyes. They combed the riverbanks, praying she had only slipped and not been taken. They knocked on doors, neighbors opened their homes, and always the Mercers welcomed them in, offering water, bread, and kind words. The Mercer boys joined the search, their voices carrying Mary's name across the prairie, though when night fell and the neighbors returned exhausted, the boys slipped back into their barn, their eyes bright, their hands restless. Mary had not been taken by raiders or drowned in the river. She was carried into the Mercer barn, wrapped in silence. The boys had waited for this moment, rehearsed it with animals, perfected their instruments with precision. Mary was small, and her body fit easily into their frames. They placed her gently, whispering to each other in their private language, making sure the ropes did not burn her skin, making sure her breath was steady. They were not careless, not cruel in the way of men who strike in anger. They were methodical, almost reverent. To them, Mary was not a child but a subject, an offering, a chance to prove that their devices worked as they were meant to. They watched the way her chest rose and fell, how fear made her breathing quicken, how her muscles strained when tension grew. They whispered notes into their ledger, 3 minutes before trembling, 5 before sobbing, 7 before the eyes rolled upward. They adjusted the pulleys, loosening when the heartbeat grew too frantic, tightening when silence threatened to take her too soon. Their purpose was never to kill, not yet. Their purpose was to listen, to study the fragile thread between life and death and see how far it could stretch without snapping. Outside, the town's grief deepened. Mothers held their children tighter, fathers polished their rifles and spoke of raiders, though no tracks had been found. The church filled with whispers, prayers rising for Mary's safe return, though most knew no return was likely. Yet the Mercer parents spoke with calm certainty that Mary was safe in God's hands, and their words soothed where they should have unsettled. Neighbors nodded, grateful for such steady voices, never seeing the hollow calmness as a mask for something darker. The boys sat beside their parents in the pews, their faces solemn, their eyes lowered, their voices soft as they joined the hymns. No one could imagine that just beyond the prairie road, Mary's cries were still echoing in a locked loft, muffled beneath beams of wood that seemed to breathe with her. The boys called her sessions lessons. They learned how fear shifted from wild panic into quiet despair, how the body grew limp not from weakness but from surrender. They discovered that tears dried after hours, that sobbing gave way to silence, and that silence was not the end but a new stage, a deeper one where the body still lived though the spirit seemed to drift. They believed this state was closer to truth than any sermon, that suffering peeled away the false layers of flesh and revealed the soul's raw shape. To them, Mary was not dying but showing them a secret, and they recorded every detail with steady hands. The livestock sensed what the townsfolk would not. Horses pulled away from the barn, their eyes rolling white, their hooves striking the dirt in frantic refusal. Dogs whined and scratched at the ground when led near its doors. Even the crops seemed to bow differently near the barn, as if the soil itself bent under the weight of what was happening within. Yet neighbors explained it all away. Animals were skittish, weather was strange, the war had made everyone uneasy. It was easier to believe in raiders or fate than to imagine the smiling Mercer boys were capable of such horrors. Mary's disappearance left an ache in the town, but the ache dulled with time, as it always did. Winter came, and survival demanded focus. Children still played in the dirt roads, though now mothers watched them more closely. The search parties ended, the doll was buried with prayers, and Mary's name slipped into the silence of memory. Only her parents kept the grief alive, their faces worn with unanswered questions. The Mercers brought them food, prayed with them, sat beside them as if their calm presence could mend what had been broken. The kindness was noted, admired even, and no one thought to wonder why the Mercer boys always lingered at the edge of the grieving home, watching with quiet eyes that measured each sob, each broken breath. Inside the barn, the ledger grew heavier with notes. Mary's lessons filled pages, each number precise, each observation recorded with the same care a scholar might use in studying the stars. Yet when her body finally grew still and would not rise again, the boys did not weep. They carried her gently, their hands reverent, and laid her beneath the earth behind the barn. They whispered that she had given them knowledge, that her silence had fed the prairie itself. To them, her death was not an end but a beginning, proof that their devices worked, that the barn was listening, that they had found a path no one else dared to walk. And so Mary's absence became a footnote in a town already scarred by war and hunger. No one knew her final cries had been turned into lessons, no one saw the instruments gleaming in the loft, waiting for the next offering. The Mercer boys still smiled, still helped, still prayed. Their innocence remained their perfect disguise, while the barn, their breathing chapel, prepared for more. The Mercer barn no longer felt like a farm building. With each season, it shed the identity of a simple storehouse and grew into something more deliberate, a place of study as much as ritual. The boys had learned what fear did to flesh and bone, but curiosity drove them further. They no longer wanted only to hear the cries of suffering, they wanted to understand how the body resisted, how it bent and broke, how it clung to life when all sense and mercy said it should be gone. They began to treat the barn as a laboratory, their instruments no longer crude shapes but devices honed with near-medical precision. The ledger grew thick with drawings, charts, and diagrams, each page filled with numbers so exact it seemed impossible boys their age could write them. The war fed their obsession. Men came home from the front broken and scarred, carrying stories of field surgeons who cut off limbs without chloroform, who stuffed rags into mouths and sawed through bone in tents heavy with blood. Those stories reached the Mercer boys through whispers in town, and each detail was absorbed, treasured, written into their hidden scripture. They read from worn medical pamphlets passed around by farmers seeking to treat injuries at home, pamphlets that described arteries, pressure points, and the proper way to stop bleeding. Where others saw instruction meant to save life, the boys saw new possibilities. They began to practice with a surgeon's detachment, not seeking to kill but to prolong, to hold life steady on the edge of the abyss without letting it fall. They built new instruments to serve this purpose. One device used thin rods to press against the ribcage, holding the lungs just enough to force shallow breathing but never enough to suffocate completely. Another involved clamps fashioned from iron scraps, tightened around joints to prevent circulation yet loosened just enough to keep the limb alive. They learned how to revive a body after it had gone limp, using cold water, pressing at the chest, or shaking until air rushed back. They began to measure the exact interval between stillness and return, counting heartbeats, whispering to each other like priests marking time in ritual prayer. To them, revival was proof that death was not final but pliable, something that could be shaped like clay if only one had the patience to study it. The boys grew skilled in separating body from person. They no longer flinched at cries or begged silence. Instead, they leaned close, listening as if each sound were a lesson whispered directly into their ears. They believed suffering was not an accident but a language, one the world refused to hear but which the barn amplified in every groan and gasp. When their subjects screamed, the boys did not hear agony, they heard patterns. They charted the rise and fall, the sharp notes and the long, dragging tones, and they adjusted their instruments to play those tones longer, clearer, until the music of pain became something they believed only they could understand. The ledger reflected this new philosophy. The handwriting was clean, the words detached, never once describing what they did as cruel. Instead, they wrote phrases like respiratory trial, vascular interval, and spinal suspension. Their records read like the pages of a scientist, stripped of emotion, reduced to numbers and observations. Yet beneath the cold language was the pulse of obsession, the belief that what they pursued was not mere cruelty but discovery. They convinced themselves that one day the world would thank them for their knowledge, though deep down they knew the world would never accept such truth spoken aloud. That secrecy only fed their devotion. At times, their parents entered the barn but only into its lower half, never climbing the loft where the true work took place. They saw the order, the tidiness, the rows of tools polished and hung, and they praised the boys for their discipline. If they heard faint noises, they explained them away as restless animals. If they noticed the smell of blood, they told themselves a calf must have been butchered. Perhaps they suspected more, but suspicion is easy to bury when silence is safer. On the prairie, families survived by ignoring what they could not fight, and the Mercer parents may have been no different. The animals grew stranger with each passing season. Calves born on the farm sometimes carried wounds that did not come from natural birth, scars too clean and deliberate to be accidents. Chickens lived long after their throats should have ended their lives, staggering with gasps that echoed into the night. Neighbors whispered that the Mercer farm was cursed, that unnatural things grew in its soil, but the family's generosity silenced much of the talk. The Mercers shared food during famine, gave freely to the church, and their politeness made suspicion seem cruel. Who would accuse the family that prayed for everyone else? The boys pressed further, convinced that their instruments could not only prolong life but strip it down, peel away the illusions of comfort until the soul itself was laid bare. They experimented with cycles of deprivation, withholding breath, then granting it back, repeating until their subjects no longer fought but waited. They saw this waiting as a state of purity, a place where the human spirit was closest to truth. They whispered to each other that they had discovered a threshold, a doorway no preacher had ever spoken of, and that each victim was a key turning in that lock. And still, in town, the boys were praised. They helped rebuild fences after storms, they led hymns when the pastor's voice broke, they smiled with innocence so perfect that no one could imagine the truth. The contrast grew sharper, and in that contrast lay the deepest horror, that evil does not always snarl or rage but smiles politely, offers help, and walks home under the same sun as everyone else. The ledger thickened, the devices multiplied, the barn grew heavier with silence. Yet the boys remained calm, their masks intact, their rituals precise. They no longer feared discovery, for who would ever suspect the children who prayed the loudest? The science they practiced was unspoken, hidden behind walls of wood, but it had already carved itself into their bones. And soon, the need for greater trials would return, for animals and stolen moments were not enough to satisfy the hunger they had nurtured. The barn, heavy with breath, waited for its next subject. The Mercer boys came to believe that breath itself was the essence of life, the one thread that separated the living from the dead. Blood could spill, flesh could tear, bones could crack, but as long as breath moved in and out, the soul was still tied to its vessel. They began to see every inhalation as an offering, every exhalation as a kind of prayer, and they decided that the most sacred ritual they could perform was to control that prayer, to hold it in their hands, to decide when it would be given and when it would be taken away. In the loft of the barn, the ritual of breath was born. Their devices evolved to match this obsession. They built frames that bent the body so that lungs could not fully expand, machines that pressed iron bars gently against the chest to make each inhalation shallow and strained. They threaded ropes and pulleys in such a way that victims could be lifted just enough to tighten the throat without closing it completely, forcing air to fight its way through. They experimented with cloth soaked in water, laid over the mouth to dampen the rhythm, letting breath become a stutter rather than a steady song. Each method was tested not for speed, but for endurance, stretching the line between life and death into a long, trembling chord. They discovered quickly that the body resisted in predictable patterns. Panic came first, wild thrashing, eyes wide, mouth clawing at air. Then came the slowing, as the body accepted that it could not fight the weight pressing down on its lungs. After that came the stillness, the moment when breath seemed to falter, when lips turned blue, when silence whispered of death. But the boys were careful, and they always pulled back before that silence became final. They revived with water, with pressure to the chest, with jolts of sudden air forced back into the lungs. They timed it with precision, counting the seconds between panic and collapse, recording each trial in their ledger like monks transcribing scripture. The ritual became more than experiment, it became worship. The boys believed that each cycle of suffocation and revival was a kind of communion, proof that they were touching something greater than themselves. They whispered that the barn was listening, that the walls leaned closer during these moments, that the air grew heavier as if the structure itself hungered for the sound of labored breathing. They told each other that the prairie outside was barren because no one else knew how to feed it, that only through these offerings of breath could the land be satisfied. They were no longer just boys with instruments, they had become priests of a secret faith, a faith whose altar was wood and rope, whose hymns were gasps and choked sobs. They began to ritualize their actions. Before each session, they washed their hands in cold water, as if purifying themselves. They drew chalk circles on the barn floor, placing the instruments inside with careful symmetry. They recited verses from the Bible, twisting the words until they no longer spoke of salvation but of sacrifice, telling themselves that what they were doing was not wicked but necessary. To them, each victim was not a neighbor or a child but a vessel chosen to reveal truth, a vessel they believed they alone had the right to guide. They convinced themselves they were not taking life but preserving it, proving that the boundary between life and death could be crossed again and again, as long as they were the ones holding the ropes. The town remained blind. The Mercer boys smiled with the same politeness, offered the same helping hands, and sang the same hymns in church. Their voices carried clear and sweet, and no one could imagine that those same voices had whispered encouragement to a body gasping beneath an iron bar the night before. The neighbors saw only innocence, because innocence was what they wanted to see. The war had already stolen so much that people clung to the illusion of goodness wherever they could find it, and the Mercer boys provided that illusion perfectly. Yet animals still knew. Horses shied at the barn, their nostrils flaring, their bodies stiff with unease. Dogs refused to approach, growling low at the door before slinking away. Even birds seemed to avoid the rafters, circling above but never landing. The barn held a weight, a rhythm that pulsed like a hidden lung, and the creatures of the prairie sensed it even when the humans could not. At night, when the rituals were strongest, the air around the farm grew thick, and travelers swore they heard a sound like many people breathing in unison, though no lights burned outside. The Mercer parents continued their silence. They answered questions with calm words, praised their boys for their discipline, and offered comfort to grieving neighbors whose children were gone. They either did not know or chose not to see, and perhaps that was the deepest cruelty of all, the evil of looking away. On the prairie, denial was its own kind of survival, and so the parents let their barn become a temple to something unspeakable, their smiles unbroken even as whispers of missing children grew louder. The boys no longer feared discovery, for they believed the ritual protected them. They whispered that as long as the breath flowed, as long as the cycle continued, the barn would keep them hidden. They believed they were chosen, not by God but by something older, something that fed on the slow rhythm of suffering. And with each revival, each gasp forced back into trembling lungs, they became more certain that they were no longer merely boys on a farm but keepers of a secret that the world was too weak to face. The ritual of breath bound them together. They spoke less in town, more to each other in their private codes, their bond deepening into something unbreakable. They no longer dreamed of childhood things but of new instruments, new methods, new ways to shape life into silence and pull it back again. Their innocence remained untouched in the eyes of the world, but in truth, they had shed it long ago. What they wore now was not innocence but its mask, flawless and impenetrable. And so the barn breathed with them, its walls swelling with the rhythm of each cycle, its silence broken only by the gasps of those caught in the ritual. The prairie outside slept under the stars, unaware that within a single farm, life and death were being twisted into worship. The ritual had only begun, and the boys were not finished. They believed the prairie was still hungry. By the spring of 1864, whispers about the Mercer barn had spread far beyond their farmstead. The prairie carried sound in strange ways, and sometimes at night the wind seemed to funnel toward the Mercer land, bending the cries inside their loft into faint echoes that traveled farther than the boys intended. Neighbors spoke of strange noises heard across the fields, low gasps, broken laughter, a kind of chanting that never seemed to form words yet carried the rhythm of prayer. At first these reports were dismissed as tricks of distance, as coyotes, as owls, as the shifting wood of barns against cold winds. But the sounds grew clearer. There were sobs that no animal could make, laughter that belonged not to joy but to something cruel and fractured, the kind of sound that claws into memory long after it fades. It was children who noticed first. Playing in fields or fetching water near dusk, they froze when they heard faint voices carried on the breeze. They swore they could make out names being spoken, sometimes their own, called in tones too soft to be shouts yet too deliberate to be the wind. They ran to their mothers, trembling, insisting they had been summoned by something in the Mercer barn. Mothers hushed them, but the children refused to pass that farm again. Their fear was pure, untrained, untouched by reason, and it carried the sharp edge of truth. Adults tried to explain what their children had heard, but unease was spreading. Men walking home late swore they heard hymns echoing faintly, but hymns sung backward, each note bending in ways that unsettled the heart. Women fetching water told of hearing weeping, a sound so soft it seemed to seep through the grass itself. When they brought their fears to the Mercers, the parents only smiled with calmness that bordered on eerie. They said the prairie was filled with echoes, that war and loss left spirits restless, that the sounds were nothing but grief carried by wind. They spoke with such conviction that neighbors forced themselves to nod, though the unease remained. The Mercer boys only grew sharper in their masks. In church they sang louder, clearer, their voices rising above the congregation like bells. Their politeness seemed almost radiant now, as though every gesture of kindness was designed to erase suspicion. They carried baskets for elderly women, they bowed their heads deepest in prayer, they even visited grieving families to offer comfort. But beneath the softness of their words, their eyes carried something else, something bright and watchful, as if they were measuring how grief bent the body, how sobs stole breath, how silence filled a room after prayers were said. To the townsfolk, their attentiveness was seen as sympathy. Only those who looked too closely felt it was something colder, something that studied rather than cared. The voices in the barn grew bolder. Some neighbors swore they heard singing at midnight, but it was not the Mercer family's voices. It was higher, fragile, cracking with strain. The songs never carried full verses, only fragments of repeated lines, drawn out until the words lost meaning and became moans. Others claimed to hear laughter, not the boys' but children's laughter, echoing unnaturally as though many throats repeated the sound at once. The barn became known as a place of echoes, a place where sound bent wrong, and people began to avoid walking near it at night. Paths that once cut across the Mercer's land grew over with grass as travelers chose longer routes. The animals on neighboring farms reflected the fear. Dogs refused to hunt near the property, circling back with low growls. Horses bolted when driven too close, sweat darkening their coats even in cool air. Some claimed their own livestock grew restless at night, lowing or clucking in agitation as if answering voices only they could hear. Farmers muttered that the land was tainted, but none dared say it too loudly. The Mercers were too respected, too generous, too calm, and suspicion seemed both ungrateful and dangerous. Inside the barn, the boys had grown used to the sounds spilling outward. They believed the voices belonged not to their victims but to the barn itself, repeating the lessons it had absorbed, breathing them back into the prairie. They whispered that their rituals had awakened something, that the wood of the walls now carried memory, that every cry pressed into the beams had left a stain that would never fade. They began to encourage the voices, speaking to the walls as if they were alive, praising them when the echoes grew stronger, calling them proof that the barn was feeding on what they offered. The parents' denial deepened. When questioned about the noises, they shook their heads and insisted their boys were asleep upstairs, that their family prayed quietly and harmed no one. Sometimes, when the voices outside the barn rose too loudly, a parent would answer the door in the middle of the night, calm and smiling, assuring anyone who knocked that the children were resting peacefully. They invited neighbors inside, gesturing upstairs to the boys' tidy beds, and indeed, there the Mercer brothers lay, eyes closed, faces serene. No one dared to lift the blankets and see that their bodies were warm but restless, their breathing shallow as though they were only pretending to sleep. This contradiction unsettled even the most trusting. How could the barn cry out when the boys were in their beds? How could laughter echo when their parents swore the house was quiet? The mystery only deepened the fear, and fear, when unspoken, festers into silence. People stopped asking questions.